Friends, thank you for being here today. We need to have a very serious, very clear-eyed conversation about what is happening on this continent. If you have been watching the news lately, you have seen the headlines screaming about General Motors. You have seen the footage of the Oshawa assembly plant in Ontario, where an entire production shift was just mercilessly slashed. You have read the devastating figures. 500 direct employees thrown out the door, and when you factor in the supply chain, the parts manufacturers, the logistics coordinators, the local businesses that depend on those wages, we are looking at over 2,200 hardworking people who woke up with a solid, middle-class life and went to bed with their economic foundations completely shattered. And we cannot forget that this is just the latest blow in a very short timeline. Only months prior to this, GM gutted its Bright Drop electric van operation at the Cami plant in Ingersoll, evaporating over 1,000 jobs in the blink of an eye. If you are keeping track, that is over 2,000 highly skilled Canadian manufacturing jobs wiped off the map in under 6 months. Now, if you listen to the talking heads on American cable television, or if you read the corporate press releases coming out of Detroit, they will try to sell you a very specific, carefully focus grouped story. They will tell you GM is simply realigning production. They will claim the company is just adjusting to an evolving trade environment. They want to frame this as a tragic but necessary reality of modern economics, just a localized story of a company making tough choices. Do not believe a word of it. That narrative is nothing but a smokescreen. It is corporate code for the chaos induced by impulsive, emotion-driven American trade policies and the blunt force trauma of 25% import tariffs. But more importantly, the story being peddled south of the border fundamentally misunderstands the Canadian response. They expect us to play the classic victim. They expect Ottawa to issue a polite, strongly worded letter of disappointment, wring our hands, and simply accept our fate as collateral damage in America's new wave of economic nationalism. They are wrong, dead wrong. What we are witnessing right now is not the story of a Canadian defeat. We are watching the end of an era, the end of bending the knee to U.S.-centric corporate bullying. And more importantly, we are seeing the beginning of a new chapter of cold, calculated Canadian economic sovereignty. We are not watching Canada retreat. We are watching Canada rewrite the rules of global engagement. To really understand the magnitude of this shift, let's take a closer look at what some folks are calling the American win. Right now, in certain political circles in Washington, they are taking victory laps. They look at GM pulling the Chevrolet Silverado production out of Oshawa and moving it down to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they see a massive triumph of protectionism. They see 50,000 units of truck production allegedly brought back home. But let us strip away that patriotic rhetoric for a second and look at the cold, hard data behind this shell game. General Motors did not replace 1,200 secure, well-paying permanent Canadian jobs with 1,200 secure, well-paying permanent American jobs. That is the great lie of this tariff war. What GM actually did was hire roughly 250 temporary workers at their Indiana plant. Let that sink in. They traded generations of highly skilled Canadian auto workers, people who built their communities, paid their taxes, and perfected their craft over decades, for a fraction of temporary American labor. These new hires in Indiana are not getting the same pay. They are not getting the pensions. They are not getting the comprehensive health benefits. And they certainly do not have job security. So let's be absolutely clear. This is not a victory for the American working class. It is the exploitation of the American working class, cleverly disguised as economic nationalism. General Motors is utilizing this chaotic tariff environment to systematically degrade labor standards, slashing their permanent workforce in Canada to replace it with a cheaper, disposable, temporary workforce in the United States. The executives win, the shareholders see a momentary bump, but the hard-working people on both sides of the 49th parallel are being hollowed out. And if anyone needs hard proof that this emotion-driven, chaotic American strategy is fundamentally flawed, you don't need to listen to political pundits. Just look at the smartest money in the history of American capitalism, Warren Buffett. When the Oracle of Omaha makes a move, the entire global financial market holds its breath and takes notes. Back in 2017, Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway held a massive stake in General Motors. Tens of millions of shares. It looked like a classic value play, but as the geopolitical winds shifted, as trade agreements were torn up and replaced with impulsive tariffs and aggressive midnight rhetoric, Buffett didn't wait around for the inevitable collapse. He started dumping his shares. By the end of 2023, the greatest investor of our lifetime had completely exited his position in America's most iconic automaker. Why would he do that? Because Buffett understands something that the politicians in Washington seem entirely incapable of grasping. You cannot build a sustainable, profitable industry in a state of perpetual warfare. Buffett stood before his shareholders and issued a chilling warning. He stated clearly that trade should not be a weapon. He went so far as to call tariffs an act of war to some degree. Buffett looked at the American strategy, the aggressive hoarding of supply chains, the alienation of closest allies, the weaponization of the border, and he saw a recipe for absolute disaster. The profit margins in the auto industry are already razor-thin. When you inject the massive friction of 25% tariffs into a supply chain where parts traditionally cross the US-Canada border up to 7 times before a single vehicle is finished, you do not create prosperity, you destroy capital. The numbers bear this out with brutal clarity. The U.S. strategy has triggered catastrophic corporate write-downs. Just look at GM's $7.2 billion loss on its electric vehicle business at the end of last year. Look at the fact that Berkshire Hathaway is currently sitting on a historic, unprecedented cash pile of over $347 billion. Why is that staggering amount of money just sitting on the sidelines? Because smart capital flees chaos. Smart capital runs away from environments where the rules of trade can change at 3 a.m. based on an angry social media post. The United States is currently operating on emotion, bluster, and zero-sum aggression. And it is costing them dearly. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you directly, have you seen this happen in your own community? Have you watched good, permanent manufacturing jobs get traded away for temporary, precarious labor just to satisfy a corporate spreadsheet? Take a second, go down to the comments, and share your experience. This is a conversation we need to be having as Canadians, and I read every single one of your stories. So, while Washington is operating on emotion, let's look at how Canada is responding. Let me tell you about the Canadian counterstrike. For a long time, the assumption has been that Canada is just the polite neighbor to the north, too dependent on the U.S. market to ever truly fight back. Historically, when a multinational corporation decides to leave, the script dictates that Canadian politicians express deep regret, offer some retraining funds to the displaced workers, and quietly accept the loss. Not this time. This time, the adults in the room stood up, completely bypassed the emotional rhetoric, and deployed the most devastating weapon in the modern economic arsenal, the rule of law. When GM announced its cuts, the Canadian government did not throw a tantrum. They did not threaten to slap arbitrary taxes on American goods in a fit of pique. Instead, Canada's industry minister, Mélanie Joly, stepped up to the microphone and fundamentally changed the paradigm of corporate welfare. She announced with absolute legal clarity that the Canadian government is going to claw back every single dollar of public funding that was given to General Motors. This is a seismic event in international business. Think of it as the Clawback Doctrine. Minister Joly's message was a masterclass in calm, calculated sovereignty. The government's position is unassailable. We gave you, General Motors, Canadian taxpayer dollars to build infrastructure and maintain jobs within our borders. You took that capital and you moved those jobs to Indiana. Therefore, you are in breach of the social and legal contract. We are not asking for an apology. We are coming to get our money back. And make no mistake, Ottawa is not bluffing here. This is not just political theater designed for the evening news. Just weeks before the GM announcement, the Canadian government served a formal default notice to Stellantis over their idled plant in Brampton. By executing these maneuvers, Canada has established a rigorous, terrifying new precedent for multinational boardrooms. We have transformed subjective political subsidies into binding, heavily scrutinized, enforceable legal contracts. The message echoing from Ottawa to boardrooms in Detroit, Wall Street, and beyond is unmistakable. The Canadian market is open for serious long-term partners. But our public treasury is officially closed to corporate extortion. If you try to use Canadian tax dollars to subsidize an American political agenda, we will unleash an army of forensic accountants and corporate lawyers to reclaim our national wealth. We do not need to shout. We do not need to posture. We simply enforce the contract. It is the ultimate triumph of cold logic over volatile emotion. What do you think of this approach? Are you glad to finally see Ottawa growing a backbone and treating these subsidies like binding contracts? Let me know in the comments if you support the Clawback Doctrine. I think it's about time, but I want to hear your take. But I want to be clear about something. Ottawa's game plan goes far beyond just handing out penalties. The GM departure, while deeply painful for the families in Oshawa and Ingersoll, is actually acting as a necessary catalyst for a much grander, far-reaching strategic pivot. It has finally laid bare the danger of placing all our economic eggs in the basket of a deeply unpredictable, politically erratic neighbor. We are waking up to the reality that we do not have to beg for a seat at the American table. There is a whole world out there, and Canada is uniquely positioned to dominate the 21st century chessboard. Look at the immediate vacuum left by GM. As the American giant pulls back to lick its self-inflicted wounds, global heavyweights are stepping right in. Toyota is actively expanding its RAV4 production in Ontario. This is a massive vote of confidence from one of the most meticulously run corporations on Earth. When Toyota looks at Canada, they do not see a subordinate market. They see a highly educated, highly skilled, reliable workforce operating within a stable, predictable, rule of law environment. And the chessboard is wide open right now. The Canadian government is already sending veiled yet unmistakable signals to the rest of the world. If Detroit wants to abandon the highly integrated Canadian ecosystem to chase temporary labor in the Midwest, Canada possesses the absolute sovereign right to invite European, Japanese, and rapidly expanding Asian players like BYD and other EV titans to set up shop right here in our backyard. Can you imagine the geopolitical shockwaves in Washington if state-of-the-art Chinese or European electric vehicles start rolling off Canadian assembly lines, built by Canadian union labor, right on America's northern border? That is the true leverage of an independent nation, which brings me to the ultimate trump card we hold, the one piece of the puzzle that absolutely guarantees Canadian economic relevance for the next century, and it literally lies right beneath our feet. The future of advanced manufacturing, from electric vehicles to aerospace, from grid-scale battery storage to defense technologies, relies entirely on critical minerals. You cannot build the future without cobalt. You cannot build it without lithium, nickel, graphite, and rare earth elements. The United States is absolutely desperate for these materials. They are facing a monumental supply chain crisis, finding themselves deeply reliant on foreign adversaries for the very building blocks of the green tech revolution. Canada, on the other hand, possesses the Canadian Shield. We have these resources in absolute, staggering abundance. If the United States wishes to build tariff walls and retreat into economic isolationism, let them. Canada does not need to force our resources across a hostile border. We possess the diplomatic maturity and the established trade infrastructure to bypass the U.S. entirely. Through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, with the European Union and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, in the Indo-Pacific, Canada has direct, tariff-free access to billions of the world's wealthiest consumers. We have the materials the world needs to survive the next industrial revolution. We have the skilled labor to refine them and the legal frameworks to protect them. If Washington wants to buy our minerals, they will pay fair market value and they will respect our sovereignty. If they try to weaponize trade, we will simply load our resources onto ships in Halifax and Vancouver and sell them to allies in Berlin, Tokyo, and Seoul who actually understand the value of a stable partnership. We hold the checkmate. But let me take this one step further, because our leverage is not just buried under the rock of the Canadian Shield. It is woven directly into the social and infrastructural fabric of this country. If we are going to talk about the chessboard of global manufacturing, we need to address the elephant in the room, the massive, hidden costs of doing business in the United States that nobody in Washington wants to talk about. For decades, the American narrative has been that they offer the ultimate pro-business environment: lower taxes, fewer regulations, weaker unions. But when you look under the hood of the American manufacturing engine today, it is choking on its own structural failures. Let us talk about healthcare. South of the border, healthcare is not just a political football, it is a crushing, existential tax on American manufacturing. Companies like General Motors and Ford have historically been described as large health insurance HMOs that just happen to make cars on the side. Every time an American automaker hires a permanent worker, they are taking on a massive, unpredictable liability for medical premiums and legacy retiree health costs. It is a system that literally bankrupts American companies and forces them to slash wages and hire temporary workers just to keep the lights on. Here in Canada, we have something they do not: a universal public healthcare system. And I want you to stop thinking about our healthcare system merely as a social safety net and start recognizing it for what it is on the global stage: a ruthless, multi-billion-dollar competitive advantage. When a multinational corporation sets up a plant in Ontario or Quebec, the Canadian taxpayer is absorbing a massive portion of the overhead that would otherwise strangle that company's balance sheet. We provide a healthy, secure workforce without the paralyzing corporate liability. That is not just good social policy. That is brilliant, cold-blooded economic strategy. And then there is the energy grid. We are entering an era where advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and electric vehicle production are going to require staggering amounts of electricity. The American power grid is a fragmented, aging, privatized mess. We have all seen the news out of places like Texas: rolling blackouts, catastrophic failures during winter storms, a system pushed to the absolute brink of collapse because it prioritizes short-term quarterly profits over long-term national resilience. How can you promise a foreign investor that you will build the factories of the future when you cannot even guarantee that the lights will stay on during a cold snap? Compare that to the Canadian advantage. From the massive hydroelectric dams in Quebec and British Columbia to the robust, state-of-the-art nuclear facilities in Ontario, Canada possesses one of the cleanest, most reliable, and most abundant baseload power grids on the face of the earth. We are not just offering companies tax breaks. We are offering them the uninterrupted, clean energy required to power the next industrial revolution. In a world increasingly defined by energy scarcity and carbon tariffs, our grid is a geopolitical weapon, and we hold the keys to the control room. We often take our healthcare system and our power grid for granted, don't we? But when you look at it through this lens, do you agree that our social stability is actually our greatest economic weapon? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think we should be promoting this Canadian advantage more aggressively on the world stage. Furthermore, we are winning the global war for talent. While the United States continues to tear itself apart with chaotic, deeply polarized debates over immigration, effectively hanging a "do not enter" sign for the world's best and brightest, Canada is quietly using a scalpel. We are operating a targeted, merit-based system, aggressively recruiting the top-tier engineers, the battery researchers, the software developers, and the advanced metallurgists that this new economy demands. When global talent looks at North America right now, they see a United States plagued by gun violence, political instability, and a fraying social fabric. And then they look north and they see stability. They see safety. They see a country where the rule of law actually means something. So, when politicians in Washington thump their chests about bringing a few hundred temporary jobs to Indiana, let them have their hollow victory. They are playing checkers while their house is catching fire. We are playing grandmaster chess. We are leveraging our natural resources, our superior energy infrastructure, our healthcare advantage, and our social stability to attract the smart money, the long-term capital that understands where the world is actually heading over the next 50 years. Friends, we are living through a profound transition. I will not sugarcoat it. The GM shutdown is a deep, agonizing wound for Oshawa, for Ingersoll, and for the families whose lives have been upended. The transition away from the comfortable, decades-old integration of the North American auto industry is going to be bumpy. The ghost of the 1965 Auto Pact is finally fading into history. But this disruption is exactly what we needed. For too long, we have operated under the assumption that our economic destiny was tied inextricably to the mood swings of Washington, D.C. The events of the past few months have proven that relying on a symbiotic relationship with an erratic, inward-looking neighbor is a vulnerability that Canada can no longer afford. Just look at the contrast in governance that this crisis has exposed. The United States is currently utilizing zero-sum aggression, a policy framework that is resulting in higher prices for their own consumers, the flight of intelligent capital, and the replacement of stable careers with precarious temporary jobs. It is a nation fighting a rearguard action against the realities of global trade. Canada, meanwhile, is responding with the quiet, devastating power of contract enforcement. We are aggressively defending the dignity of high-quality labor. We are executing a global strategic diversification, looking east and west rather than exclusively south. We may be smaller in population. We may not have the loudest voices or the most bombastic politicians on the world stage. But history shows us that on the grand chessboard of international geopolitics and global trade, cold logic, institutional stability, and the unwavering application of the rule of law will consistently outmaneuver bluster, short-term thinking, and corporate greed. The North American dynamic has fractured, perhaps irreparably, but we do not need to mourn the past. Out of the ashes of those assembly lines, Canada is already forging the foundation for a stronger, more sovereign, and truly global economic future. We are standing our ground, we are protecting our own, and we are playing to win. Before you go, I want to hear your final thoughts. Do you believe Canada is finally positioning itself to win in this new era of global trade, or are you still concerned about the turbulence ahead? Drop your perspective in the comment section below. If this analysis resonated with you, please share it with a friend or family member who needs to hear it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.